And with that, I have started the recording, so you guys could take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, Michelle. Let me actually turn on my video really quick for introduction. Let me know if this is coming through okay, hopefully. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Kayla Keelan. I'm a hazard mitigation specialist here in FEMA Region 10, and I will be one of your presenters today along with my colleague, Cody. And actually, Cody, maybe I can turn it over to you just so you can say hello, give kind of a face to the name. Cody, we can't hear you. I'm not sure.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Sorry about that. Hello, everybody. Cody Seibart. I'm also a hazard mitigation assistant specialist with FEMA Region 10, and happy to be here this morning.
All right, thank you, Cody. And then if we can, Brenna, if you don't mind just popping on your video just as well, just to say hello. Brenna is Menegini, who you may have heard her on other sessions, will be joining us here kind of behind the scenes with some of the Q&A as well.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can now see me. My name is Brenna Menegini. I'm going to be here kind of behind the scenes today to help answer any questions you have.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you all. We are going to be kicking off today with the capability and capacity building, otherwise known as CNCD, project scoping application development. So this is, next slide, please. Thank you. This is our third webinar of our webinar series here in FEMA Region 10. So we're here on September 30th, and we'll go from 10 o'clock to 11:30. And then we also have a number of other webinar sessions coming up over the next couple weeks, as you can see here on the screen. And the link here is below, so if there's anything that particularly stands out to you, feel free to follow that link to register for those. But we love these webinars. We do them every year, and just very excited to share some information with you today, and just hoping we can answer any questions you may have. Next slide. So a little bit of housekeeping, so just kind of short and sweet, because Michelle did cover some of this here at the top of the hour. But first off, questions. We welcome any questions. That's really what we're here for today, is to make sure we can answer any questions you may have about BRIC as well as project scoping in particular. We do have everyone on mute, but that said, there is a Q&A box, so feel free to drop questions in there as we go along, and Brenna will be monitoring that and answering them as they come in. And then probably also during some of those breaks, we'll also, I'll turn to Brenna to see if there's any questions we should kind of talk through a little bit more here throughout the presentations that come up. We'll also have some interactive knowledge checks. We really love these. We think it's kind of just a fun way to get a quick gut check to see how we're doing, where we are. So please, we would welcome your participation in those. And then if there's any technical issues, if you were on our webinar last week, we did have some technical issues, so please just flag for us if the audio is coming in a little bit choppy. If there's anything that you're kind of experiencing on your end, you can directly send a message to Michelle, our host here, in the participant chat box. So please do that if there's anything that comes up, and we'll try to navigate that and get you going in the right way. And then last up is participant panel. There's a couple of features on there, so that's at the top. That's where you can find the Q&A as well as the chat box. All right, next slide. Okay, so our agenda today, just kind of what to expect. We have a couple of items here up on the screen. We are going to start off with a BRIC overview, so really just kind of looking at the basics of BRIC, so the funding, the timeline, just some key items to be aware of. And then we're going to dive into project scoping fundamentals. So what are the key items to be familiar with when we talk about project scoping? And then we'll be followed by really kind of digging into what are the tips and challenges or things to be aware of when developing a project scoping application. And then lastly, we will really touch upon the final takeaways in the sense of what are some reminders, the timeline, and deliverables kind of going forward. And then actually the last thing, because I did just say last, the last thing is really kind of looking at any resources to be aware of or helpful items, and if there's any remaining questions, we'll make sure to have some time at the end to answer them. All right, next slide. And Michelle, I'm just going to ask really quick, can you hear me okay? Because I'm getting a little feedback.
I can hear you really well. If there's anyone that's not muted, it looks like we have everyone muted, so you sound good to me.
Okay, all right, check it. All right, so diving into our first kind of agenda item here, which is the BRIC overview or BRIC fundamentals. And the first thing to kind of be aware of when we talk about BRIC is it's a national competitive grant program. So under the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program here at FEMA, we do have several grant programs, BRIC being one of them, and this is our competitive program. So it's a little bit different than our other program that you might be familiar with, which is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. So this means it has different funding sources and criteria, and every year the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, is released kicking off the program for that fiscal year. So fiscal year 2021, which is what these webinars are here for, is the one we're currently under, and that was released in August. So that NOFO really kind of gives the full details of the program, so the funding, the deadlines, the requirements, and so forth. And just a few things to note about this year, Notice of Funding Opportunity. There wasn't a couple changes. So we saw a significant increase in funding, which is something we'll talk about a little bit in more detail here in a second. And there were also some new priorities that were outlined in the NOFO, such as enhancing climate resilience and adaptation, and then a couple other changes in the NOFO. So I would certainly encourage you, if you haven't already, to really take a read through that to be familiar with the BRIC program. And then a few other things to be aware of under BRIC fundamentals is it replaced our pre-disaster mitigation PDM program, and it is a pass-through and reimbursement-based grant program. So who is eligible? So you can see here up on the screen, a federally recognized tribe can apply directly to FEMA as the grant applicant or as a sub-applicant through the state. A tribe or village or the state that's located in must have received a major disaster declaration in the past 7 years. And as of spring 2020, everyone is eligible to and satisfies this criteria due to COVID and so forth. So eligible as a grant applicant directly or as a sub-applicant through the state. Next slide. So some key information to keep in mind if interested to apply for a project scoping sub-application. The first thing is a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan, an HMP. That is required to apply for project and project scoping sub-applications. And it's required both at the time of the application deadline, which will be January, and at the time of the grant award. It's not needed for a planning, subgrant, or management cost application, but it is needed for a project scoping and project application. If your tribe does not have one, you certainly encourage you to look at some of our planning guidance documents. And we also had a webinar last week where we really walked through what are some of the first steps in setting up an HMP for a community. The webinar is located on that link I showed earlier, and we'll recirculate that at the end as well. But certainly that's a great resource to check out in regards to some of the fundamentals for an HMP. The other item to be aware of is FEMA Go, so FEMA Grants Outcomes System. So everyone will be required to submit their application through the FEMA Go system and set up an account and manage that sub-application through that system. So once you start moving forward to submit a project scoping application, you'll need to go through the FEMA Grants Outcomes, FEMA Go system. And if you're not familiar with it, and I know some of you all might already be familiar with last year, but if you're not familiar, there are some really helpful YouTube tutorials on FEMA's YouTube channel that give you some of those tips and tools for navigating the system and applying through the system. All right, next slide. Okay, so BRIC funding. So I mentioned this on a previous slide. We saw an increase in BRIC funding this year under fiscal year 2021. So let me just walk through it a little bit in detail. And this might be a refresher for some if you attended any of our other webinars, but we did want to make sure we covered it just in case you're attending this one as your first webinar. So let's walk through this graphic we see here. So first off, FEMA will distribute up to $1 billion through the BRIC grant program under fiscal year 2021. So that is an increase of funding this year, which is great. And that $1 billion is broken up into 3 buckets of funding. So let me just kind of walk through the slide, starting from the left and kind of moving to the right. So in that first column, we have $56 million to be set aside for all state and territory allocations. And then more specific to us today is that second column of funding, which is a tribal set aside. And as you can see here, there is $25 million set aside for federally recognized tribes. And in that last column, this is the larger chunk of funding and an estimated $919 million for tribes, state, and territories for national competition for mitigation projects. So those 3 funding buckets make up the $1 billion. And for today's purposes, I just kind of want to walk a little bit more through columns 2 and 3. So in that second column, the $25 million tribal set aside, there are 3 check marks underneath it. And these are the types of sub-applications that can be submitted under the tribal set aside. And that's management costs, capability and capacity building activities, and mitigation projects. And then if you kind of go down that column here in the second row, you see here the tribal set aside, it has a $1 million federal share per applicant. So that's actually an increase of $400,000 from last year. And that's per applicant. Okay, and then the last column here, the $919 million, just to kind of note that this is for mitigation project applications only and management cost applications. So project scoping would not fall under this $919 million. They need to be submitted under that tribal set aside. All right, next slide, please. So let's talk through the tribal set aside a little bit more, just because this is what is relevant to our webinar today. So the tribal set aside, the capability and capacity building activities, CNBCB, these are, I think we've talked about it on a previous webinar, but as a refresher, we kind of sometimes nickname these as the non-brick and mortar types of applications. So in the graphic here, you can see examples of CNCB activities, such as planning sub-applications, building code sub-applications, partnership sub-applications, and then, of course, what we're here today for is project scoping applications fall under CNCB. So that means project scoping activities are only fundable under the tribal set-aside. The project scoping activities are not eligible for funding under the national competition, so that $919 million, only fundable under CNCB, and you can submit more than one sub-application. So the key takeaway here for funding for BRIC is project scoping applications are funded through the tribal set-aside, and that is up to $1 million federal share. Next slide. Excuse me. All right, so cost share. So this is something we've covered in a couple of other webinars, but it's a really important one to cover because I think this goes back to kind of what to expect in regards to funding. So if you've applied to any programs in the past, you've seen the 2 different types of cost share that are available. And cost share, or otherwise it's known as match, is the total cost to implement approved mitigation activities, and it's funded by a combination of federal and non-federal sources. So you can see here on the screen how the program provides funding between that federal and non-federal sources. There are 2 categories. The first one we have here is that standard cost share, which is that split or total cost is split between 75% federal share and 25% non-federal share. Important thing is to note is that federal share cannot exceed 75% of the total. And I want to stress that just because we have seen applications come through where it's 75.6 or 75.2 or 76, so forth. But you want to make sure that calculation is correct and it falls at 75% or lower, just because it wouldn't be eligible if it's above that 75%. And then the other cost share option that is available is the economically disadvantaged rural communities cost share, as you see here on the right. And that is a split between a 90% federal share and a 10% non-federal share. The criteria to be able to apply for the EDRC, economically disadvantaged rural communities, 90-10, you can see here the 2 bullet points that highlight what will be required, and that is, first off, it needs to be a community of 3,000 or fewer individuals, and it needs to be economically disadvantaged. So that means residents having an average per capita annual income not exceeding 80% of the national per capita income, which is a little bit of a mouthful. So the best thing I would say is to take a look at the NOFO. It breaks it down nicely in regards to what would be required to apply for the 90-10. Certainly encourage you to apply for that. If you think you fall in this cost share and be eligible for this cost share, please put that in the application. We can and document it as best as you can. You see here in red at the bottom, use the best available data that you have available to you. There are a lot of rural, sorry, there's a lot of, my dog decided to participate in the webinar. There are a lot of rural areas and communities here in FEMA Region 10 that may not have this information as readily accessible. So do your best and submit what you can, and then we can always have that conversation moving forward. But if it's not submitted in the original application, we can't go back to change it. So if it's submitted at 7525, that would be what it's submitted at. Give me 1 second, please.
While we're waiting, there is a question from Janelle. They asked, so any one tribe can apply for up to 1 million and not be in the national competition, but are you still competing with the tribes who are also applying for the bucket set aside? If any of the panelists would like to answer that.
Do you mind taking a quick stab at that one? Thank you.
That's a great question. So what? Yeah, no problem. So that's a really good question. So the 1 million is not competitive, correct? Unless it's unless you have submit a project that's over 1 million. But if you are submitting within that 1 million set aside, no, any of those activities you would put in, you know, whether it's hazard mitigation plan or project, building codes, that does not go to the national competition. But as you asked, will you be competing with other tribes? So there is a limit of $25 million for that set aside nationally. It's called the set aside rate. So $25 million is the set aside amount. So in that case, there could be some options for if we get over those amounts. This year, for example, we did not get over the set aside amount. So nothing, you know, no applications had to be changed or moved to the competition. Projects potentially could be moved to the competition. However, I know FEMA headquarters is going to be prioritizing CNCB activities after that 25 million is reached, as well as looking at the possibility of doing direct technical assistance for any amount over that 25 million that has already been reached. So let's say there's 25 million in tribal applications which meets the set aside. So let's say, okay, so 27 million, that's a better number. So let's say there's 27 million in that set aside for applications submitted. In that case, you know, some of those CNCB activities could be moved to direct technical assistance. So if there's perhaps scoping activities or capacity building activities, let's say partnerships, things like that, headquarters would look at how to prioritize it that way. There is more information in the notice of funding opportunity on that as well. But again, we didn't reach that threshold this year. Doesn't mean that we're going to meet that full set aside this year, but it also doesn't mean we may not. So it's important to be aware of that as well.
All right.
So go ahead and put anything into the chat too if that doesn't answer your question.
Yes, I think funding.
Let's see, maybe if Kayla is able to come back. Looks like her dog is very interested as well.
Can you guys hear me? Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks for that. And Brenna, I appreciate you providing more context around that funding and cost share and everything that comes around that. We can have many conversations around it. So if we did not answer that, or there maybe there's a little bit more to the question, feel free to drop that in the chat, and we can, Brenna and I can keep answering that as we go along. So thanks for that. And I think that is the last one we have here on the slide. Again, just kind of noting in regards to cost share, if you believe that you fall under this 90-10 split, please apply for that and use the best available data. There's some resources we have here up on the screen, the links to kind of look to. They're good places to start in regards to pulling information to document that. And then, of course, if it's not eligible or it's found not eligible, you are still eligible under the 75-25 split. All right. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so moving into project scoping and some of the fundamentals around that. So first off, I keep going back to the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, because it really is an excellent resource to take I want to say about, I can't remember how long it is, but it is an excellent summary of all the requirements and kind of details about the various programs under, or applications available under BRIC. So first off, project scoping. This is the definition or the description pulled from the NOFO up here on the screen. So I actually just want to say if everyone can take a second, I'll go on mute. And if you can just read that paragraph up on the screen really quick. Okay, so in case I was trying to scroll real quick to see if we have anyone via phone. I don't think we do, so you should be able to see this up on the screen. But essentially, I just wanted to kind of highlight this in regards to what the Notice of Funding Opportunity says in regards to project scoping. And I bolded some sections here, which is to develop mitigation strategies and to develop complete applications. So project scoping can really be used as a tool to develop mitigation strategies and develop full complete project applications in the future. So I know we've had a lot of participants listening on the webinar with experience in developing applications, and as you know, a full project application can take a lot of time and money to develop. And project scoping, I find it such an extremely beneficial and important tool to really just help you get started. It's that opportunity to help fund some of the pieces and elements in advance and lay the groundwork for communities to prepare for mitigation projects or strategies for future use. And as a result, also to have a stronger, hopefully, application and be able to move that application through a little bit faster. One thing to note about project scoping here is, or as a reminder, project scoping is not implementing the actual project itself or conducting any physical groundwork. So that would be done in the project, not project scoping. And I just want to say that because we have seen that come through a number of times where we see that it's kind of mixing those two pieces together. So project scoping is the doing that work in advance in regards to engineering studies, BCAs, et cetera, kind of some of those key components needed for application, but it's not actually conducting the physical groundwork needed for the project. Okay, so let's take this definition you see up here on the screen, just in a little bit more detail, walk through it. So next slide, please. So project scoping, so the first red highlight we had on the previous screen can be used to develop mitigation strategies. So this means your community has identified a hazard, but not sure how to resolve or mitigate that hazard yet. So for example, as we see here up on the screen, we have a community center that flooded continuously and repeatedly over the years. So we know that's the hazard, it's flooding, but we are not sure how to address it yet. So the project scoping can, in this case, be used to help the community conduct the research, the analysis, and identify what are the different ways, actions that they can take to mitigate this flooding problem. So based on the data that's gathered here, the community will be able to address their options and prioritize the best action to mitigate that flooding threat. So it really can help do that analysis to say, hey, we know this hazard, but now what are the most cost-effective and feasible options to be able to reduce this hazard. All right, next slide. And then the other part of that definition or that description of project scoping and what it can be used for is to develop full, complete project applications. So in this case, this means a community already knows the hazard. We know what the hazard is, and we also know what the mitigation action that the community wants to take. But what's still needed is there's certain elements of a full project application that need to be developed so you can submit an application. So for example, we have a community facility here on the screen, or we see kind of a snapshot of the surrounding facility that faces frequent power loss due to severe storms, and the mitigation action that was identified both in the HMP and through community identification was to install an emergency generator for this critical facility. So both of these examples are kind of pictures pulled from previous sub-applications submitted and funded. So the project scoping, and in this case, was to help to develop elements needed to submit an actual project application later. So here, the project scoping was used to hire contractors to conduct a benefit cost analysis, BCA, and do some of the other front load work needed, so engineering as well, design. So some of the elements were taken under the project scoping, so they had all the materials, documentation, and information needed to submit a full project application later and get this funded. All right, next slide. So we have a quick knowledge check. Okay, so our first one. So true or false, every project scoping grant should result in the creation of a complete HMA project application. I think we have a minute here up on the screen, so you can either choose A, true, or B, false. And Michelle, if we end up getting all the answers in before the time limit, we can show that.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it looks like we do have all the answers in, and most people said false.
Okay, so let's see here. So just repeating that, sorry, my screen froze for a second. Yes, so I think the majority of you provided false, which is correct. So every project scoping grant does not have to result in a complete HMA project application. So as we highlighted, project scoping can be used in a number of different ways. It could be used to scope and do analysis to just figure out what are those mitigation actions even kind of available that are feasible and cost effective. That's not resulting in a complete HMA project application. It's being used to really kind of scope the mitigation actions itself. So good job. I think we got the majority of false. All right, next slide, please. So moving along, so just kind of choosing to start with project scoping, just a few things I wanted to mention. If you do think this can help you with kind of the overall project process, so really kind of walking through that step by step, go ahead and take a look at the NOFO. So this will give you a good chance to see an overview of the process and expectations to be familiar with. And then also I would encourage you to look at the BRIC program support materials. There is a 2-pager on project scoping, so giving an overview of a little bit more detail, summarizing what project scoping is used for and what's required. And Cody, I might ask if you can pull that resource and drop it into the chat for anyone that's interested. But it really can help with kind of overall project process to kind of take things step by step. Another thing to be, if you do choose to start with project scoping or you think this would be beneficial for your community, check out the FEMA Go system. There is a project scoping application template. And that's really helpful just to see what would be required, what would be needed to submit in your project scoping sub-application, so you can start to prepare and get a sense if you feel ready to go ahead and move that forward. And then one thing just want to flag, and Cody will talk about this in more detail, is completing your sub-application as clearly as you can. So be detailed on the proposed project scoping activity and include all those required sub-application elements. And one thing to flag, it doesn't always necessarily have to be extremely lengthy. I think sometimes we see applications come, and actually I should preface that lengthy is good too, but really the important part is to be very clear in your scope of work and in your work schedule and document that. You're submitting that application to someone that's not familiar with your project, so you want to make sure that you're being very clear and documenting and including any resources to help paint that picture for FEMA, who's going to be reviewing that information. So just we'll talk, I'll kind of put a pin on that there because Cody will kind of talk through that in more detail as well, but I want to highlight it. And then also lastly, here up on the screen, if you are choosing to start with project scoping and think this would be a beneficial tool, going back to your hazard mitigation plan that your community has, taking a look at that. If there are already hazards and actions identified but need help with getting those started, project scoping may be that tool to use to really kind of kick that off. So that's a good thing to kind of reference back to, of course, to make sure that's one of your fundamental documents you're taking a look at before you start down the project scoping route. Next slide. So a couple of examples. I just will say this is not an exhaustive list. The next two slides where I really just pulled over some of the traditional project scoping examples that we would typically see, and these are also outlined in the NOFO and the program support materials, that link that Cody will share with you. So we'll just kind of quickly walk through these. But project scoping can be used to scope and develop hazard mitigation projects. So we kind of talked about that a little bit. So that could be doing the engineering design and feasibility studies. It could be used for conducting meetings and outreach to kind of really start looking and having those conversations to identify potential future mitigation projects. It could be evaluating facilities or areas, again, looking to what are those mitigation actions that would be appropriate. Environmental planning and historic preservation. If you have submitted a project application to FEMA in the past, you know that EHP, so the Environmental and Historic Preservation Review, is certainly a lot of details that are going to be taken into consideration and making sure that coordination has taken place. So this project scoping is a really good tool if you have a pretty robust and complex larger project. You could front load some of that EHP work here using project scoping. And then last here on the screen, collecting data. So really kind of doing that research analysis and collecting data that would be needed for BCAs, the benefit cost analysis, environmental compliance, and so forth. Next slide. And then a couple more that are examples that we see here, conducting hydraulic and hydrologic studies for unmapped flood zones. A lot of times we see utilizing third-party cost estimation services or contracting services to collect data or to conduct or address data consistency needs. So that's certainly a way that could be utilizing project scoping. Next slide. And then I also just want to say the last two slides were kind of those typical examples we would see. And then I just want to give some recent examples of project scoping applications here up on the screen. These were some that were submitted to FEMA Region 10. Some of them have already been funded, and some of these are kind of still moving through that review process. But just to give a little bit more tangible of what we have seen here in FEMA Region 10. And kind of walking through these, we've seen tsunami evacuation project scoping come through, which was a lot of different elements involved. So they used project scoping, or was advanced assistance at the time, to develop the components needed to submit a full project application in the future. So in this case, it was used for conducting a BCA, for an engineering report, and so forth. We've also seen it for a number of times, actually. I've reviewed quite a few backup generator project scoping applications in the past in regards to using project scoping as a means to develop installation designs and BCAs for a generator and identified for critical tribal facilities in their HMPs. So seen a number of those come through. Wildfire mitigation assessments, a lot of those have come through in recent years in regards to using project scoping as a means to assess wildfire risk and scoping potential mitigation actions for the reservation. We've seen a couple home relocation assessments, project scopings applications, and this is can be fairly large projects or complex projects. So using project scoping to do some of that front load work to really kind of set the larger project application and broader community projects for success. So using project scoping to conduct some of the engineering and feasibility studies to potentially relocate homes due to erosion and flooding hazards in this case. And then another example we've seen is water line seismic retrofit studies. So the project scoping was used to conduct the preliminary engineering design, the cost estimate, looking to see about building codes, et cetera, to be able to develop a future project application. So you can see with a lot of these examples here, again, it's kind of looking at what are some of those elements and components that we can work on now to really get all our ducks in a row, to make sure we're really setting ourselves up for success, that it's robust and documented, and not just sub-applications, but project implementation. That's going to really be beneficial in the long run for the community. So project scoping is that means to just kind of get some of that front load work conducted and finalized. And this is by no means a full list of projects. We've seen quite a number of really interesting ones come through over the years. For example, we've also seen urban heat index project scoping sub-applications submitted recently. So again, it's ever evolving. It's whatever the hazard is, and certainly using project scoping and being creative to be able to front load some of that work. Next slide, please. And we have one more knowledge check, or next knowledge check. So please select the statements below that are true. Project scoping activities are A, designed to develop future mitigation strategies or complete mitigation project applications. B, do not require applicants to have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan. C, are not eligible for funding under the national competition. And D, requires a benefit cost analysis. So please select the statements below that are true.
We have just a couple people finishing up here. Okay, so it's looking like most participants are selecting A and C as their final answer.
That is correct. I feel like we're in jeopardy. That is correct. So yes, so project scoping activities are designed to develop future mitigation strategies or complete mitigation project applications, and they're not eligible for funding under the national competition. They're only available under the tribal set-aside. And for those that pick the other ones, potentially, just to kind of recap, project scoping activities do require applicants to have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan at the time of the application submission, as well as the time of the grant award. And project scoping activities do not require a benefit cost analysis. Most often we see project scoping being used as a means to conduct a benefit cost analysis and get that documentation put together. All right, so that wraps up the project scoping fundamentals. I just want to walk through briefly just what it is used for, and really to develop those mitigation actions and application. And what I would like to do now is actually turn it over to Cody to really kind of start diving into how what we expect in regards to project scoping application itself. So Cody, over to you.
Thanks, Kayla. Okay, so now I'm going to start diving into the weeds a bit on the various components that make up the application when putting together project scoping project. Next slide, please. So as with most FEMA application development, project scoping is a very involved process. And there are 4 elements that will make up the development of the application. So we have the scope of work, the schedule, and the budget, which all 3 are required to be submitted with your application. And then supporting documentation I'll get into a little bit later on sort of what is required versus what could be or should be submitted along with the application package. Next slide. So the first element of the project scoping application development is the scope of the work. And the scope of the work, it essentially identifies the eligible activity and it describes what will be accomplished as well as explains how the mitigation activity will be implemented. So what makes for a good scope of work for project scoping? In general, this is a clear, concise description of what the application is going to address and how that will be achieved. So the things that we're looking for in this section essentially boil down to the 5 W's and how. So we're looking at who, what, where, why, when, and how. So who does the project benefit or who is affected? Who are the direct beneficiaries as well as potentially some of the indirect beneficiaries of the project? Who is involved in the project and how are they being utilized? Are there partners that you've already identified with or you've already identified and are coordinating with? Be sure to mention those, as well as who is performing the work. So which personnel is going to be involved in this project. So what is the objective of the project? So what info is being collected or analyzed? What is the hazard or problem being mitigated? What is the outcome of this project scoping work? Where? So where is the community located? Where are the identified hazards located in relation to the community? Elaborating a little bit on that. The why this approach? Explain your strategies and solutions. Explain why your strategies and solutions are necessary. And then the when, so the timeline and the key milestones associated with the project, and I'll get into that with the schedule. And then the how, so how will this be implemented and or solve the problems that you've described? So how does your specific activity help to achieve a future mitigation project and application? Next slide. Takeaways for the scope of work. Key takeaway number 1, as Kayla mentioned earlier, we're looking for clear and concise description, essentially that tells a story answering that who, what, where, why, when, and how. So to avoid an incomplete scope of work, we recommend that you answer all of these questions and that the description clearly should state the problem the project is attempting to mitigate. So write the scope of work in a way that someone can understand it with little familiarity of the subject material. And we also recommend trying to avoid as much jargon as possible. For example, I myself am not a certified floodplain manager, and of water hydrology flow. So if it is an aspect of your program or you're doing some sort of study that involves a little more technical expertise, being clear and using simple language will help the reviewer understand your project a little better. Another key takeaway is that the activities included in your scope of work must be described in sufficient detail to verify the cost estimate. So what is included in your scope of work must align with the elements composed in your cost estimate. Third key takeaway is in order to avoid a common error of incorporating aspects of multiple projects into one. So this is, if there's components in the scope of your application that overlap with a separate FEMA, HMGP, or hazard mitigation grant program, or potentially another project funded by completely different entities, for example, for Service Management, Department of Agriculture, receiving money from elsewhere. Be sure to differentiate those activities and funding sources in your scope of work. So if the reviewer is reading your scope of work and cannot distinguish between the multiple overlapping projects, it's going to raise questions. Next slide. So the second element of project scoping application development is the schedule. And the schedule outlines all the major milestones or tasks necessary to implement the scope of work. So each task or milestone in FEMA Go must include a start month, duration of the task, and description of the task. And it's important to be realistic with your time frames. The period of performance for these projects cannot exceed 36 months. So all projects must be performed and completed within that time period. Be sure to give yourself enough time to accomplish each of those individual milestones accordingly. And once again, that time period, the period of performance for your project will begin once the project is awarded. So next slide, please. And so here's an example of what a schedule looks like within the FEMA Go system. So this is a sample schedule that demonstrates what an engineering design study project might entail. So these are tasks essentially, the sequence of milestones that you'll achieve as you implement and progress through your project. So as you can see, the information provided in this section includes the task name. And remember that each of these tasks should clearly align with the scope of work. And then you also see the starting point and task duration. So these are the units of time. Typically, these are in months. And a brief description of the task. Describe what the task is and include who from the project will be completing that task. So short, concise, to the point, simple schedule. And a couple key takeaways for the schedule. One, be sure to divide the milestones into measurable tasks, activities with realistic timelines. Again, sufficient detail should be provided so that FEMA can determine whether these proposed activities and tasks can be accomplished within the period of performance. So if the procurement strategy, if you're including a strategy to procure a design or engineering firm, and you're showing that would take a year or 6 months, instead of maybe 2 to 3 months may arise. So just be sure that the timeframes are realistic and achievable. And although it's not included in this example, it's important to include time for the closeout and liquidation period. So this is something that oftentimes is overlooked, but be sure to account for this activity. And typically that's a couple months. So at the end of your project, that closeout period and liquidation time, does take anywhere from several weeks to a few months. So just be sure to account for that time as well. And a second key takeaway, as was mentioned previously by, not every project is going to have the creation of a project sub-application as its goal, as shown in the sample here. So there's a distinction in the outcome of project scoping grants between completing some sort of project scoping activity, potentially a feasibility study, or completion of a BCA, or an environmental and historic preservation assessment, versus completing a full project development where you're ready to submit a full project, or what we like to call shovel-ready projects that are ready for construction. So this example shows a schedule where the objective is to create a full project sub-application versus a different grant where the objective is to collect enough data to do that BCA, or in a hydraulic and hydrologic and hydraulic paper on the floodplain zones. your schedule should align with the specific tasks and your scope of work, leading to its goal, whether that's collecting data, developing a BCA, conducting a design survey, or developing a full application. Next slide, please. So the third element of project scoping application development is the budget. Proposed budget costs should always directly link back to your scope of work, as well as align with the milestones and tasks in your schedule. So remember, each element of your project scoping application should continue to build off of one another. So here with the budget, you're identifying the proposed use of funds in sufficient detail for each proposed task or milestone. So you want to provide that supporting budget documentation to back up your costs. Although this is supplemental, we strongly recommend, and I'll reemphasize, strongly recommend to include a detailed budget narrative attachment that describes how those various elements in your budget do align with the scope of work and milestones. The budget narratives are very helpful for us as the FEMA reviewer because it provides context to the numbers in the budget and helps these projects get awarded much quicker. Also, be sure to include documents that justify these estimated costs. So, for example, you're hiring an engineering firm to conduct a study. So, explain how you arrived at that contractual cost estimate. Are you including supporting documentation of engineering quotes from 3 firms and you took the average of those 3 to use for your budget? Just be sure to attach those estimates or quotes from an engineering firm because that would help explain the rationale for why those costs are included at that specific estimate. So as you'll see here on the screen, these are the cost line item budgets that align with the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, cost categories. And the budgets that you'll be submitting in FEMA Go, we do require that the cost line items align with these OMB cost categories. So this slide shows that a few of these budget classes that align with those: personnel salaries, personnel fringe, contractual supplies, equipment, travel, and pre-award, which I'll discuss on the next slide here. So pre-award costs are those costs that are directly related to developing the BRIC application or sub-application that have incurred prior to the date of the these are costs prior to the date of the award. So what are pre-award costs? A few examples are writing the application. If there's staff time involved in writing this application, those can be included as pre-award costs. If there's workshops or meetings related to the development and submission of your BRIC application, if you're preparing any sort of design specifications, or any other costs directly related to the development and submission of that application, are eligible for reimbursement as pre-award costs. One thing to note here is in order for those costs to be eligible for funding, these pre-award costs must be identified in budget. And these costs are not guaranteed. So pre-award costs will only be awarded if they're eligible and the project application is successfully granted funding. So applicants who submit an application but do not receive an award and expense the pre-award cost in the development of that application will unfortunately not receive reimbursement. Next slide. All right, and we have another knowledge check. So quick knowledge check to see if everyone's awake. Please select true or false regarding the statement below. Pre-award costs are guaranteed if included as a separate line item. I'll just give a minute.
Okay, so it looks like most participants are responding with B, false.
All right, everybody, yes, this is false. So once again, pre-award costs are not guaranteed, and they will only be funded if your grant is selected and funded, but they do need to be included as a separate line item. Next slide, please. So here's an example budget and what it looks like in FEMA Go with a few different cost line items included for this particular example project. So I'll get into this on the next slide, but the arrow that you can see next to the cost line items, selecting that arrow for any line item will allow you to provide more info. And as you'll see, each of the line items are broken out. So an important thing to note is that these costs should not be lumped together in a lump sum. And once again, if we can't determine how the funding costs were arrived at, we'll come back with a request for information. So we always strongly encourage including sufficient detail as well as providing that supporting documentation. Next slide. So here's where the cost line items are broken out. And this is where you'll be inputting the information within the FEMA Go system. So you'll select the item, as you can see in the top left portion of the box there, including the quantity. So for this example, this cost line item is for supplies. There's three: quantity, the unit of measure, and the unit price, and then the unit total. And then you'll also be selecting a budget class, so whether that's supplies, personnel salaries, fringe, contractual, etc. And then if I can just bring your attention to where the pre-award is located. So that is something that will need to be marked in the FEMA Go system if it is a pre-award cost. So you will mark that section. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a sample budget narrative that aligns with the previous example of a design engineering project. This example only shows a portion of a budget narrative. It doesn't necessarily include all of the elements of that particular project. And one thing I'd like to bring your attention to is the references to a description. So you can see for this particular budget narrative, it includes staff fringe, for example, 20% fringe for utilities, director benefits, see attached documentation of staff salary and fringe. So referencing back those attachments in your application and noting how these costs are derived. And a couple key takeaways for the overall budget. Number one, ensure your figures are reasonable, allocable, and to provide quotes, estimate, and details to justify these costs. Key takeaway number two, double check the numbers and be sure they add up correctly. Sometimes system errors do ensure that the total costs in the FEMA Go system within your budget align with the totals in your budget narrative and vice versa, because that can happen. And key takeaway number three, be sure to explain the line items by describing these costs in the budget narrative attachment. So provide justification for lump sum costs. How did you arrive at that cost? Explain if it is an estimation based on previously incurred project costs or if this is the average cost of supplies for your office for the year, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, quick raise of hands. Is everyone familiar with anyone previously submitted management costs with a FEMA application? And you can select the hand from the bottom of the participant list there. seeing one hand. Okay, good to know. So this management costs can be a little complicated. These essentially are referred to as the indirect costs, the administrative expenses, or overhead costs. Simply put, management costs are the expenses incurred in managing and administering a federal award or sub-award. And then to note, per the NOFO, indirect costs are only eligible as management costs. So what are some examples of management costs? These typically include cost of managing the award, so quarterly and financial reporting, updating the go, no-go milestones in the schedule, the closeout review and liquidation period, etc. There's also technical monitoring aspects. This usually applies for an applicant who's providing oversight to sub-applicants, but some of those things include site visits, technical meetings, delivering technical assistance. If there's any staff salary costs directly related to performing the management of this award or the technical monitoring piece, those are also eligible costs for management costs. It's important to note that management costs, they're different from project management costs. So management costs are overseeing the entire award, whereas project management costs is any work directly tied to a specific component of the project. So for example, you hire a contractor to conduct a BCA or to conduct a design study. So the costs related to paying that contractor invoice would be those project management costs. Another important thing to note is that you must include your tribe's negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, or NICRA, to claim management costs. Otherwise, there's the de minimis, or federally recognized standard indirect cost rate of 10%, which can be used. But you must include documentation for this request. So if your tribe does have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, we would expect to see an attachment or a copy of that agreement with your submission, or a memo stating that you would like to use the de minimis rate. And with management costs, FEMA does provide 100% federal funding to reimburse costs. So they are eligible and reasonable. Any management costs or indirect costs associated with the project scoping will be reimbursed in an amount up to 15% of the total grant award, of which no more than 10% may be used by the applicant and 5% by the sub-applicant. So in order to receive that reimbursement for those management costs, there are essentially two options. So the first option, in the top of the screen there, is if you're submitting your application as a direct applicant. So you can submit up to 10% of the total grant application budget, inclusive of any sub-applicant management costs, to administer and manage the award and any associated award activities. Yeah, and any request for those applicant management costs, you must submit a separate management cost sub-application within FEMA. And so the second option is if you're applying as a sub-applicant, you can submit up to 5% of the total project sub-application budget as a line item within your budget. So if there are management cost activities associated with your application, these must both be added to your the scope of work, as well as identified in the line item in the budget section. So it's important to clearly identify this because management costs are not requested, they will not be approved. So I'll take a moment there to see if there's any questions. I know management costs can be somewhat complicated, and if anybody has any questions on that, we'll stop and give a second.
don't see any coming in, Cody. We just had one on pre-award costs, but those were, the answer was tackled.
David has a question. As a tribe, do we do a separate application for management costs?
Saying that one more time? Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, so sorry. David asks, as a tribe, do we do a separate application for management costs?
Kayla, you want to take that?
Yeah, so there's the two options. So seeing here up on the screen, so if you're applying directly as a applicant to FEMA, then you can submit a separate management cost application to receive 10% of the total grant application. So this is something we recommend because it is, of course, a bit of a larger amount, but that would need to be submitted as a separate management cost application if you're applying directly to FEMA. If you're applying as a sub-applicant, you can submit for management costs as part of your project scoping sub-application. So it would be part of your budget, your cost estimate in the FEMA Go sub-application. And when it's submitted as part of the project sub-application cost estimate, then it's only 5% of the project sub-application total. So there's two different ways to submit for management costs. One is a separate management cost application, and the other way is actually incorporating or requesting it as part of your project scoping budget. Does that clarify a little bit? Or Cody, I don't know if you want to expand upon that.
Hey, thanks, Kayla. This is Brenna. I just wanted to expand on one thing. Simply put, if you are applying directly to FEMA as a federally recognized tribe, should you have a management cost sub-application separate, right? So not in your sub-applicant management cost, but should you make a separate sub-application? And we always encourage that. Why? Is it's more advantageous. You're getting more benefits, essentially, right? You can claim your indirect cost rates and amounts in there of up to 10%. So you don't have to, but we certainly recommend it since it's more advantageous to you. Back to you guys.
We have one more question. David asks, this is still confusing because the slide shows we are supposed to do both 10% and 5%.
Yeah, thanks, David. So yes, you can do both now. This is a change to BRIC this year. So you can, so let's say you're applying for 2 sub-grants, okay? So you're applying for a plan, a hazard mitigation plan, and let's say you're applying for a hazard mitigation project. In each one of those sub-applications, you can put 5% of those totals to management costs. And then you have those, so then you have that plan for that project with those project 5% of the project budget as management costs. And then you can have a third application for grant management budget. So that what we call just, management costs, state or tribal management costs. And that's the 10% portion. So if you apply for the 5% within your application and you're a separate sub-application for grant management costs, it is more advantageous that way because you would get both, right? You would get the 10% in the separate sub-grant application as well as 5% in each of your sub-grant applications that are activities, so your project and your plan. Hope that clarifies it a bit more.
He has a follow-up question. So a project scoping has a 5% and then a separate sub-application for 10%?
Correct. So like, let's say you are just applying for project scoping as a tribe. So you're coming directly to FEMA. So let's say your project scoping is $100,000. So 5% of that would be $5,000, right? So your application would be for $105,000. And then you could apply for grant management costs separately as a sub-application, which would be 10% of that. So 10% of that 105. So that's, if that kind of makes more sense in the terms of just applying for one. So project scoping or, or a plan application that could have up to 5%, and then that separate management cost sub-application would be 10%.
Thank you so much. I think that's it.
It is, management costs, like Cody said, can be a little bit confusing too, like even for us in regards to kind of, there's a lot of different options. You can apply for the 5%, the 10%, you can apply for both. I think this is good feedback too. We'll try to work on this slide as well. But I did drop in the NOFO just with some of the references to the page numbers for management costs. That breaks it down a little bit there as well. So hopefully that's helpful. I just want to share that out just because there are a lot of questions on management costs too, and please keep raising them here because this is a good place that we can talk it through. So thanks for bringing those questions up.
Yes, thank you, Kayla and Brenna, for that. Next slide, please. So we have one more knowledge check here, and this is a multiple choice. So please select the best answer. For management costs to be awarded, A, you must submit a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, or UNICRA. B, must request management costs with the application. C, cannot exceed 10% of the application budget for applicants or 5% for sub-applicants. Or D, all of the above.
We have about half of our responses in, so I'll give them just another few seconds here. It looks like most everyone is answering with D, all of the above.
Yep, and that would be correct. So for those costs to be awarded, all of the criteria would need to be met. So you need to submit the indirect cost rate agreement, request those costs in your application, and do not exceed that 10% of the application budget as a direct applicant or 5% as a sub-applicant. All right, next slide. So the fourth and final element of project scoping application development is the supporting documentation. And better documentation leads to more successful project applications. So the more information you provide, the quicker the review process will go. And it's important to begin this documentation process early. So this also helps if your project scoping application will lead to a complete HMA application for a future award cycle. Potentially involves construction activities. All those documents in order will help streamline not only this application process, but future review processes as well. So what type of documentation is required? So we're looking for a cost share match commitment letter. So the cost share or matching means the portion of the project costs that are not paid by federal funds. So as mentioned earlier, this would be the 25% non-federal match that is supported by the 75% federal share, or the 10% match, which would be supported by 90% federal match for those eligible economically disadvantaged rural communities. We're also looking for the standard forms. So with project scoping, there's two forms that you'll need to attach and include or upload separately. And that's the SF, or Standard Form 424. That's the application for federal assistance. And then the SF 424A, Budget Information for Non-Construction. So it's the 424A non-construction because project scoping projects are not construction activities. And then the system will prompt you to sign the SF 424B, which is our standard assurances for non-construction projects, and then the FEMA Form 20-16C, which is certifications regarding lobbying or other workplace requirements. So once again, the system will prompt you to sign those highlighted in red, and then the SF 424 and 424A will need to be attached and included or uploaded separately. So what type of documentation should be submitted? We essentially look for, depending on the project, of course, but we look for photos. So if there are, a project site that's been identified, we do like to see color photos, at least 2 color photos. We like to see maps, whether those are street maps, topographic maps, floodplain maps, wildland urban interface maps, anything that's associated with your project, and maps that can depict that location. We do like to see those attachments. We also like to see any sort of engineering documents. These can be pertinent studies, such as a flood insurance study, for example, or any applicable state, tribal, local building codes or engineering standards that are used. Any schematic drawings or designs, anything associated with your project. And if there are engineering docs that are included, FEMA accepts these engineering designs from registered professional engineers. So be sure that the docs are stamped and signed by a qualified licensed professional, so that that information contained is certified. And if you have any questions on what specific supporting documentation is required, I'm going to point you in the direction of the NOFO, which Kayla included in the chat for further information. The HMA guidance is also a great resource for which to refer to, and I'll ask Kayla to drop that in the chat. And next slide. And I guess before we get into the key reminder, timeline, and deliverables, are there any other questions associated with the application development? We can give everybody a moment here if there's any other lingering questions.
Hey, Cody, we do have one in the chat in regards to the example we were just talking through on management costs. I'm happy to kind of read it out, or if you want to tackle it. Or actually, let me go ahead and read it just so I have it up. So the question was, and I think Brenna is typing in the answers too, so I'll welcome you to join in as well in the discussion here. But essentially, if we have a project scoping sub-application submitted for $100,000, and so you're including that 5% management cost, so you have a total of $105,000 for that project scoping application. And then you've also decided to submit a separate sub-application for 10% of the grant totals. That would be that $10,500. So where does the cost share fit in? So it's a great question. So the cost share, or the match, is that total costs implemented or to implement approved mitigation activities. So it's a combination of the federal and non-federal share. So what we shared earlier, you can submit cost share in 2 different ways. So you have the standard, which is 75 federal share and 25 non-federal share, or if you qualify for the economically disadvantaged rural communities cost share, it's 90% federal share covered and 10% non-federal share covered. So for example, if the project scoping sub-application, if it's a total of $105,000, and let's say you're submitting for the economically disadvantaged rural communities, which is at 90-10% cost share, that means FEMA would, I need to do quick math, but I know that the non-federal share for $105,000 would be $10,500. So 10% of that application would be covered by the non-federal share by the applicant. Meaning there's a lot of different ways that federal share can be calculated. It could be staff time, it could be cash contribution. There are various ways that you could cover that $10,500. And I would refer you back to the document I dropped in earlier in the chat in regards to its cost share guidance, because they give a lot of good examples of what you could, how do you meet that total non-federal share that, and in this example, would be covering $10,500. And then also the management cost application for federal share, or excuse me, for cost share, Cody mentioned for a separate management cost sub-application, that's 100% covered by the federal share. So there wouldn't be a non-federal share, it would be 100% covered. So you would only, in this example that's posted here in the chat, the match would be 10% of that project scoping budget, which is 105. Does that help? I know it sounds a little convoluted, but again, the cost share guidance gives some good examples of how to meet that match, and also what the split would be. It would just be depending on, you know, if you're applying for a 25% standard cost share, or if you're applying for that 90%, 10% cost share. Does that help?
This is Brenna. I just wanted to make a note too. You know, I think the way you might be thinking of it too is like, how does it fit in there? So how does that full amount of 115,500 fit in there? So a way to look at this too is by sub-grant, because we award as a grant, but by the activities by sub-grant. So for example, yes, you have a cost share at the grant level, but it's really done individually in the sub-grant. So for example, your management costs, that separate 10% application, that would be 100% federally funded. But in those sub-grant applications, you need to show that, you know, in the case of 90-10, the 10% cost share and how you're meeting it. So if you try to think about it by sub-grant level, because each sub-grant, besides a separate management cost sub-grant, would have to have a match and show how you're meeting that match from that activity. So let's say you're doing a project scoping application and a plan, for example. Let's say you're saying all the staff time, my staff time is going to be used as match fully for the project scoping application, and it's going to cover both sub-grants. No, it would have to be a match for the project scoping sub-grant and a match for the planning sub-grant. So you would have, like, if that case was true and you were using your staff time or personnel time as match, then it would be match on both of those activities, not just for one activity and covering, you know, maybe 20%, so it covers both applications, but it would have to be for both individually. Hope that didn't muddy the waters too much, but try to think of it by each sub-grant, because that is where the match has to be done. Back to you.
Yeah, so please drop in the chat if there's any kind of remaining questions around that, because again, it can get a little convoluted. But again, in this example, there wouldn't be 115,000 because the management cost would 100% be covered. So it's just a sub-application where you would have the cost share. Okay, so we're moving into the last section here, which is the key reminders, timeline, and deliverables. So next slide, please. We're going to run through this a little bit faster because I know we're coming up on time and I want to make sure I respect your schedules. So applying for BRIC, this is a bit of a reminder, but it's an important one. So you have to have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan. It's required to apply for project scoping. If you do not have one, I encourage you to look at our BRIC Tribal webinar that we had last week, and it gives a good overview of what to expect and how to submit a planning application and where to look for resources. Of course, if there are any questions, you can always reach back to us as well. FEMA Go, this is where you'll be submitting your sub-application and managing that sub-application. So it's a system you will be familiar with over time as if you move forward with project scoping. The link is here, and we can also share some YouTube tutorials, and maybe Cody, I might, or Brenna, if you can drop that into the chat. Next slide, please. Award deliverables. If you do move forward with a project scoping sub-application, and actually with any application under BRIC, there are a few things to be kind of familiar with and responsible for as you move forward. So that would be, if it's awarded, documentation of accomplishments. If you do receive the funds for a project scoping application, you're going to have to track and provide documentation to FEMA to support the work that has been accomplished throughout the grant period of performance, so that 36 months that Cody referenced. This would really be done through the monitoring through quarterly reports, so we'll expect to kind of see those reporting done on a quarterly basis, and which really show the accomplishments of activities and deliverables and the project scoping status how far along it is, if there's any challenges that have come up along the way, et cetera. Accounting for use of funds, so must submit sufficient financial details to demonstrate that no costs claimed under project scoping are duplicated in subsequent project applications. So again, this will be kind of shared through quarterly reports and throughout the process. And documentation of EHP considerations. So must document that effects to environmental and historic resources were considered early in the planning and project scoping processes, and document that as we go along. I think Cody said this a few times. Brenda actually mentioned it in one of the answers in the chat. Just be sure you're documenting as you go forward, and that's also being reported through any kind of quarterlies or monitoring and so forth. Next slide. And actually, oops, I know I just said next slide, but one thing just to note, for our deliverables, we are going to have a webinar here in a couple weeks. I think it's in mid-October, which talks about the FEMA grant cycle, essentially. So really kind of talking about, okay, if you are planning to submit a sub-application and it's awarded, it's funded, then what next? You know, what are those expectations, things to be aware of as you start to implement your project scoping or project application, and what are those requirements as an applicant as you start to implement. So a lot of good stuff will come out of that webinar, and certainly encourage, if you're interested, to register for that one in a couple weeks. Next slide, please. So the life cycle of a BRIC application. The notice of funding opportunity was released, so a couple weeks ago, actually more than a couple weeks ago. The end of summer flew by, but it was released in August, and it can be found on FEMA BRIC's website. I dropped that link in the chat earlier. The application, the NOFO will kind of give you an overview of what's required, but also the timeline. So the application period opens September 30th, today, and then the submission deadline for applications is a couple months here in the future, in January 28th, 2022. I don't think we have it on the next slide, so just in case we did not share this, I do want to note, please make sure to remember this January 28th. It will say it in the NOFO, but it needs to be submitted at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So, of course, just making sure that when you submit that, it's prior to that 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And another thing, just a tip for this, is trying to submit that 2 weeks in advance is something we recommend, because you never know if any technical glitches might come up, and you want to have time to account for that. And we have a help desk to help support if any of those technical issues come up, but you want to make sure to have time to be able to navigate that if needed, and hopefully not. The selections and pre-award selection notice, so once everything's submitted and it's going to go start to undergo FEMA review, and then the selections and pre-award selection notice will not come out till summer 2022. And then the grant award will start really kind of around, these are estimated timeframes, so that December 2022 and after, and it really depends. It could take a lengthier process if there is a more involved environmental and historic preservation EHP review that's required. For project scoping, typically these move a little bit faster than a project application, as it's not as involved, but certainly it's all dependent on, you know, what the project scope of work is. And then lastly here is a period of performance. So the start date is when the recipient accepts the award. So when that gets accepted, that is the start of the period of performance. The end date is when all project scoping are 36 months from the date of the award. And the closeout is due 90 days after the period of performance ends. So that's really kind of the full life cycle or period of performance of when you accept the award. It's 36 months from there, and then the closeout materials, which Cody referenced in the work schedule, is all due 90 days prior or after the period of performance ends. Okay, next slide. Resources, there's a lot of them. There's a plethora of resources out there. So next slide, I'm just going to highlight a few. The first one is FEMA Go resources. You can see the link here up on the screen, but the one I want to point out is if any issues kind of come up along the way, you can reach out to FEMA Go at fema.dhs.gov. to really help with any technical questions or assistance in registering. And there's also a help desk phone line as well that you can reach out to get a live person as well. So that's a great tool. Please reach out to them if you have any issues. Next slide. And then there's a lot of BRIC materials and resources out there, a few here on the screen. We have the main FEMA BRIC website, and the one link underneath that is before you apply for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC funds. That's a good place to start. It gives you all the information you might need in regards to the NOSO. It also has the program support materials listed there, which are really helpful. They're 1 to 2 pagers that kind of give a little bit more information about a project type or about management costs or about cost share or project scoping. They really just kind of summarize in more detailed, concise way in regards to what to expect and what's needed. We also have the BRIC webinars that were hosted by, they were nationally hosted. They're separate from the FEMA Region 10 webinars, but those are all available online at this link. They were recorded, and there's a lot of good ones. I would pay, or I would specifically point out the ones in regards to application tips and pitfalls. Those are really helpful, and there's a few other ones out there that I would certainly encourage checking out. They're recorded, and you can kind of take a look at them at your leisure. And then Cody already mentioned these, but also the link here, the HMA guidance and resources. We have the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance webpage, and there are a couple of resources there, and that's actually the cost share guidance is included there. The Hazard Mitigation Assistance Addendum is listed there, and the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance is listed there. Those are a lot of resources, but they're helpful. You can kind of just open them, have them on your desktop, and look for specifically what you need. You can kind of do a control find to scan the document. If you're only interested to know what is needed in the scope of work, you can find that information there. Or if you're applying for wildfire mitigation project scoping, if you're interested to know what would be needed or what FEMA can help with, you can go to specific guidance on wildfire. So they're really just good tools to reference back to as you're developing your project scoping application. And then lastly, the FEMA Region 10 webinars you see here up on the screen. This is the one we're in right now today, and we have more coming up. And next slide, please. And here are the ones that are next week. We'll have project application development. So for example, if you've already conducted a project scoping application and you are ready to submit a full project application development or application, next week's webinar will really give a great overview of what to expect, what's required, some tips and challenges as you submit that. And then we have a couple webinars to follow, BCA Basics for projects, which is really, really helpful. We get a lot of questions around BCAs. They can be, at times, sometimes they can be challenging to put together. So this is we have a presenter that is fantastic and a guru at BCA that's going to be walking us through some examples and some tips and resources for doing those. And then we'll give a FEMA Go introduction and basics, and then followed by FEMA grants management. So as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is really focused on, okay, you have been awarded your funds and now what to expect, what's that management look like over the full life cycle of your grant. So a lot of good stuff coming up in the following weeks, and if you are interested in any of these, you already know how to register, but the link, since you're here today, but the link is here on the screen that can direct you to where you need to go. Next slide. All right, so this is kind of wrapping us up, and I'm sorry I'm a little bit over time, but I just wanted to point out quickly, if you have any questions, we welcome them. Please reach out to us. You can see our non-disaster grant team here up on the screen. Brenna here in the middle, who you have heard throughout the presentation, myself here on the right. We also have Ravi, who's here on the webinar supporting, and then Cindy and Rob, who are also part of the non-disaster grant team. We monitor this email, and so again, please send any questions our way. We'll get back to you as soon as possible. And you'll probably hear from us if you do submit an application. We will be, one of the 5 of us will be working with you through that process. Next slide. And then last but not least, if there are any other questions outside of hazard mitigation assistance and BRIC, we have our fantastic and wonderful FEMA Region 10 Tribal Affairs team. They are also ready to help answer any other questions you might have about FEMA. They are an excellent resource to reach out to. So we've included their names as well as their emails. If you do not already know them, then certainly feel free to reach out to them. We have Jay here on the left, Aurora, Aaron Ward, and Ramona. And Ramona is actually specific to supporting Alaska. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so I think that wraps up our project scoping presentation, and I hope it was beneficial, a good overview, some helpful tips and things to kind of expect. And of course, if there's any remaining questions, Brenna, myself, Cody, we're happy to stay on to answer any questions that may have come up. And I actually might turn it over to Brenna just because I'm trying to flip screens here if we have any other questions that came through that need to be addressed before we move forward.